The first seminar in the series this year entitled Nationalism in Education. So over the course of the 2 terms, we hope to bring together 8 or 9 different seminars to deal with this topic. Just a brief note about ASEN, for those of you who aren't affiliated with the LSE. If you haven't heard of us before, ASEN stands for the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, and it's a student-run association. We have 2 scholarly journals, we do this seminar series, and then the most exciting thing we do probably is our conference in the spring. This year's theme is Nationalism and Belonging, in the April 1st through 3rd, and the call for papers is still open until November 30th, so if you're interested. Tonight, very happy to welcome Professor Ozga. She's joining us from Oxford University, where she's a professor of Sociology of Education. Her research focuses on education and social policy within and across the UK and in the context of Europeanization of education. Tonight, her talk is entitled Crafting the Narrative of Independence, the SNP, Education, and the Political Work of Governing. And very happy to have her. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jones.
Thank you. I don't really want to stand up and lecture at you, but you've distributed yourselves all over the room, so I maybe better stand up so you can hear me, assuming that you want to. I'm really, really pleased that you asked me to come. It's very nice to see that there's an interest from specialists in nationalism in the field of education. The field of education is, I think, kind of firewalled by educationists who don't really like intruders and who don't, as a consequence, necessarily make linkages to developments in other fields that really would be of use and interest to them. So, although my title is flagged up, literally, as about Scotland, I know that's a bit of a minority interest. Indeed, I have been going to empty rooms trying to talk about Scotland, especially in England, I have to say. And what I'm trying to persuade you of here is that, A, education is a really interesting field for the study of nationalism and for the application of concepts drawn from political science and the sociology of nationalism to a field of inquiry. And it's a very neglected field in that respect. There's very little work that's really engaging with education, schooling, systems of education and nationalism. There's work on the curriculum, but that does tend to be rather focused on the content and not the process and relation. So, education first as a field of study for you, I think, is a good one. It needs the influx of ideas from other fields. And Scotland, well, I want to try and persuade you that this may be more difficult. But Scotland isn't just interesting in itself, though I think it is, but it actually offers an interesting way of thinking about nationalism as a governing project. And I think this is quite unusual, so that's really what I'm going to spend the first part of my talk attempting to explain, the way in which the Scottish National Party, the governing party in Scotland since 2007, has used nationalism, a particular form of nationalism that I call modernised nationalism, to govern with and to create and project a sense of forward movement in a particular polity within the UK. So that's what I'm going to try and do. And I want to say something, again, just by way of background, about where my own work sits in this. This is a small element of my work. My particular interest is in trying to work out how education is governed, yes, how education systems are managed politically, but more recently, and I think more interestingly, I'm trying to work out how governing is done through education. So I'm interested in the ways in which education systems, the relations within them, act to govern populations and promote and manage particular versions of citizenship or civic identity. So nationalism comes into this frame, but it's kind of, for me, come in rather late. It's come in slantwise, in that what I was trying to struggle with was the concept of Europe and education, a European education policy space, the notion of the European community as a policy-making entity in education, which of course is not how the political scientists see it at all, and indeed you will know that policy in education is preserved, defended by the nation states. So in terms of the work that I do, it doesn't sit very comfortably with political science approaches to Europe. It focuses on those informal relations, soft powers, that the Commission uses to create a landscape. It focuses on things like the use of data to measure progress, performance across the nation states and the community. And it makes the argument about governing from there that, in fact, when you measure something, you're creating it, you're calling it into being, you're making a landscape that you can see, and therefore govern. So that's my main interest, and it was in working in this field with colleagues, and I'm going to use the term we about my work, and I mean my colleagues. With colleagues, my work has been directed at comparative studies using this kind of thinking. How do the different nation states within the European community negotiate with the Commission? How do people work with the Commission or against it? How do they move between the Commission and their national policy-making processes? That sort of thing. And nationalism kind of crept in. The more work I did on Scotland in particular, the more nationalism seemed to be an element in the picture that needed to be addressed. But I'm self-taught in relation to nationalism, so I'm kind of relying on you to help me think about this topic. I can't claim that I have expertise in the field, though of course I've been honing up on my reading. Really interesting, I just went into Waterston's because I had a few minutes to spare and looked at the bookshelves on nationalism. There's absolutely nothing about the UK. And under the political science, there's absolutely nothing about the UK. Closed book list and why. So, yeah, the argument that I'm making, I use the title Crafting the Narrative. In my first slide, and crafting the narrative is a phrase that was used to us when we were researching the workings of the Scottish Government between 2007 and 2009 by Nicola Sturgeon, who's a Deputy First Minister of Scotland. And she used it, and all of the senior members of the Scottish Government use it quite self-consciously. They're aware of the fact that they're making a story. They're aware of the argument that Gordon Burns makes, that a narrative or a story is what, more than anything, a government must have if it is to succeed. So crafting a narrative is an important and really very conscious part of the strategy of the Scottish Government in its governing. And that narrative is intended to both reinforce and promote a collective narrative around the themes of growing autonomy and growing confidence. So it's a narrative that develops over time from a political party that was in the wilderness for many years, finds itself in government in 2007, to its enormous surprise, and indeed to the surprise of everybody else, including the civil service with whom they had to work. So it develops over time from saying, look, we can govern, to look how well we can govern, to look how much better we could govern if we didn't have one hand tied behind our backs by the UK government. So the narrative, crafting the narrative, is all about actually representing Scotland as a small, strong state, moving it from its position in North Britain to somewhere offshore of what they call the Scandics, the Baltic states, the Scandinavian small states, Denmark. And there's an almost literal attempt to reposition the nation, not looking south, but looking towards its northern European neighbours. And the narrative is all about doing that. So this is my argument, that the SNP creates a form of modernised nationalism, which is very much a civic nationalism, but located within globalising times, in a form that looks to the future and that tries to break the hold of the other in this case being the very powerful southern neighbour of England. Traditionally, and even in the history of the Scottish National Party as a political movement in the 1930s to the 1980s, that other was the fixation. It was the force that drove the creation of a very banal nationalism. So what they're doing is trying to actually draw a line under that, put a lid on some of the forms of nationalism that you're perhaps familiar with from popular culture, and really get rid of the whole notion of Tartan Toryism, land, blood and soil, and the high Victorian commodification of Scotland as a romantic destination full of chiefs and so on, to really eradicate that from the public discourse and move the notion of nationalism towards something really rather different, forward-looking, civic, and to do with popular sovereignty. I'll get to that in a moment. Education is a really good space in which to deliver this kind of storytelling, narrative creation. As I'm sure you can see, it's the space where this kind of process can be naturally embedded. It's also, in the case of Scotland, the source of a lot of political and cultural resource that looks backward, but looks backward in a way that's actually productive for the forward-looking message, because it's quite civic, it's quite communitarian, it's community-based, it's egalitarian. It works through referencing to those characteristics of the past to do with civic and community identity and egalitarian principles, which people in Scotland like to think characterises their education system. I think I should say here that I'm operating in an analysis that is looking at the discourse as it is presented, rather than any kind of real assessment of whether Scottish education is egalitarian or not. That doesn't really concern me here. And they have a particular mode of operating in crafting this narrative. It's a combination of what I've called referencing inwards to these civic, communitarian, egalitarian mythologies, and referencing outwards to, as I said already, Europe and the Scandics. Yeah. Is this okay so far? I don't mind if you interrupt. Because I don't know how much you know about Scotland, or if it's terra incognita, just interrupt if you need clarification, please. So that's the argument I'm going to make. So the SNP has a project, and the project is, I'm trying to say, about a collective learning. It goes beyond the idea of education policy as a particular policy field. It goes into the whole mode of operation of government. It's about bringing the nation into a learning project creating collaborative learning to support the idea of greater autonomy and independence. I'm using education as an example, but these threads, these narrative threads, are apparent across the entire public sector. And in doing this, in moving towards a narrative thread that talks about growing greater autonomy and confidence, there's a backstory signalled by the quotation here, which is that for a long time, both before devolution in 1999, when the Scottish Parliament was reconvened, and after devolution, when the Scottish Labour Party was in power, in parallel with the Labour government in England, there wasn't much change in the way in which education policy was made. It tended to be very top-down. So that's why this Cabinet Secretary for Education is saying, we had this top-down approach. People told people, who told people, who told people. And in crafting a narrative about growing independence and autonomy, what the SNP is trying to do is reverse that habit of dependence and develop more bottom-up activity. So it's actually quite a complex governing strategy. It involves almost a Stalinist approach to planning from the top, combined with a bottom-up, community-based set of activities from the bottom. So for me, this is really interesting about, how is governing work done? How do we understand new governing forms and resources? And my colleagues and I are working with a notion of the political work of governing, of seeing governing, not just in the case of Scotland, but in the other systems that we're looking at, as something that's much more understandable in the current context if we focus on collaboration, on processes, on relationships, not on the fixed entities that in which governing is addressed. I mean, I don't know how many of you know about political science approaches to the United Kingdom. They're very, very much based around territorial responsibilities, constitutional practices, and so a lot of what we're trying to do is completely invisible. And it does seem to me that those territorial and constitutional studies miss something. That's what I'm trying to say. So we're trying to look at how people discursively and interactively make meaning in these very fluid and networked sets of relations that are part of the narrative that's being crafted by the SNP. So I think I now have to probably give you a little bit of background on devolution. So this, if Scotland doesn't enter, devolution generally really finishes people off. So I'll try and do this, try and make it entertaining. I borrowed some entertainment from Tom McNair, who's really good at making difficult issues engaging and amusing. What he's doing there is drawing a parallel between the attitude of Blair's government, which introduced what they called the devolution settlement in 1999, and a young man in a pub looking at the mark on a pint glass. Blair is the pub landlord saying, why, in a Scottish accent, which of course Blair, despite being educated in Scotland, doesn't have, look son, see the mark on a glass? Well, that's it. That's all you're getting. We've settled the issue of United Kingdom international relations. There is no problem here. Shut up, drink your pint, and be happy. So in the notion that devolution is a settlement, then there is an assumption that everything will settle down, which of course it hasn't since 1999, and become incredibly more complicated once the SNP took power. But you can see, I think, if you look at the way in which, this is my rough guide to devolution, if you look at the way in which the settlement was supposed to work, you can see that it was highly unlikely to. Essentially, the reserved areas are those that the United Kingdom government still controls. So, for example, employment law, that's been a real field of contention because employment and education is devolved. They have to have a relationship, and at the moment they're separated artificially. Migration comes into the same camp. Scotland's very keen on migration. It had until very recently a declining population. Fortunately, a very large number of Poles settled in Scotland, brought their skills with them, and have been made very welcome. The problem is, of course, that the Scottish Government cannot, because it doesn't have the powers, alter arrangements in relation to right to remain. So there's a problem there. And then when we have the SNP elected in 2007 as a minority government, then as a majority, those tensions are really exacerbated. And with the SNP identifying itself as a social democratic party, then you can see that there are likely to be increasing tensions over all sorts of public sector areas, especially as the United Kingdom coalition government gets into its stride and adopts a kind of resurgent neoliberal approach to the public sector in particular. So these are some of the areas where there are differences. And in education, the two administrations are heading in increasingly divergent directions, as the SNP has committed itself to maintaining free state education from cradle to grave, and there is no business interest or involvement in the provision of public schooling or indeed anything else in Scotland. So there's a real set of tensions there, tensions which are getting more and more unstable. And the pressure on the settlement is increasing, and of course is in some ways coming to a head next year with the referendum. Just wanted to illustrate the size of the SNP's capacity in painting the map yellow in their case. You can see that there are vestigial traces of the other political parties. But in 2011, in the second of the 3 yearly cycles of elections which take place in the Scottish Parliament, I am not going to try and explain the electoral system to you, but it's an incredibly complex combination of first past the post and proportional representation. It was designed specifically to prevent a minority party coming to power. This was not meant to happen. So you have this bright yellow map, and you have a political party that describes itself as nationalist and social democratic. How do we understand this social democracy? Some of the clues are there in the narrative that's being constructed by the First Minister, talking to Parliament on the first day that it had reconvened after the election, struggling for fairness, equality, tolerance, etc. Please let me emphasize again, I'm not taking this as the truth about the SNP, but this is how they're constructing the discourse. So you can see that it's got this inward and outward tone to it. It's both going back to the idea of community, but also prompting a future orientation. And it's quite interesting in its focus on services, on public good, etc., etc. And another very important element of this narrative is the concept of popular sovereignty. The SNP and this is what makes it really problematic in the UK context, wants statehood for its nation, which isn't something that all nationalist movements demand or require. Not all nationalist parties and movements focus on statehood as a key issue, but this one does. And the language of popular sovereignty, therefore, is very important in terms of the crafting of the narrative. And, of course, also underlines the extent to which they're attempting to promote an idea of civic nationalism. And there's an interesting point here, too, about the ways in which they're able to thread in the idea that minority nationalism, I think Michael Keating has argued this, is often a modernizing and democratizing movement faced by archaic states. And if one starts to put nationalist minority movements in other parts of the globe alongside Scotland, you can see that there's actually a thread of argument that they make, which once again displaces Scotland from its geographical position, but aligns it with small struggles for social democracy, combined with nationalism in other completely different territories. But the argument about the archaic state, the state that no longer functions, is one that they make very frequently, and the argument about popular sovereignty is also very strongly there. And you can see that last statement, we need full powers, but people come before powers. The community before the constitution, children before the state. It's popular, populist discourse. Should I be finishing soon? One more bit of background. I am going to get to education shortly. And that is drawing on the argument about popular sovereignty. There's also a really important part of this project that has to do with the way in which the SFP does the work of government. And this governing work draws on the resonances of civic nationalism, which is a backward referencing, and projects it into the future. It very much aligns with new thinking about how governing is done. They read political science textbooks, these people. They're very interested in network governance. They can have conversations with political scientists about how network governance is best understood and best practiced. They don't use language around levels. They don't talk about responsibility or authority. They talk about codependence, co-production, partnership. So there's an attempt to draw together the very diverse set of interdependencies, complicated by the devolution, so-called settlement, to enable a new sense of capacity in the nation. And they are working with political theory here. And it's a very interesting question whether the political theorists are following the politicians or whether the politicians are following the political theorists. But they are, without a doubt, very consciously using these knowledge resources. They have, for example, I said here, a constant emphasis on developing the conversation from below, generating debate, generating discussion. The concordat, which is a really interesting term, I think, in itself, for government concordat with the local authorities, signals this shared mutual responsibility. And it's very different, as I tried to signal earlier, from past practices, which some people would say it's more like the government by the United Kingdom of another colony than it did the government of state. So there's this whole attempt to move governing into a different mode. And at the end, I've got a quotation from what they call Scotland Performs. They have a website on which all of the 43 targets that government has publicly promised to meet in terms of public service delivery are constant, their performance is constantly monitored and updated. And they see that very much as part of what they say is a social partnership, removing barriers between government and people. Again, this is discourse, but it's really interesting that it's nothing like the discourse of target monitoring and target setting that operates in the public sector in other administrations. It's very much about building the collective identification with the work of government. And there's also this modernised nationalism that I referred to earlier. There's a very strong attempt to take account of globalising pressures, to economise education and everything else, as everyone is doing, but to link economic drivers of competitiveness to ideas of fairness. So this is where the kind of inward and outward referencing builds the narrative, brings the economy together with fairness, and tries to manage the tensions between economic competitiveness and social cohesion. And they have been very confident about taking risks in throwing these debates open to see what comes back. So, moving on, get to nationalism now and education. I'm sorry it's taken me so long, but I felt you needed some of that background in case this was new to you. And I think there has been, for a long time, at least in the field of education, if nationalism surfaced at all, it was very much about the 19th century growth as a nation state. And this coincides, it was said, with the provision of mass education in order to help with the formation of national identity. There's also, I think, a very strong school of thought, which is Anglo-American rather than European, but nevertheless dominates the field, that with globalization there's a homogenization of education policy and practice. There's a standard agenda which is being monitored by the OECD and the World Bank and promoted by them, and that eventually through performance monitoring everything looks more or less the same. And that the nation state as a consequence is simply losing authority and power within the education field. I think what's interesting here then is to think about nationalism as a resource that mediates or translates some of those influences. I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about education globally. And I'm trying to sell you the Scottish case as one where the particular configuration of the politics with a nationalist party actually makes all of that tension between the global and the local, the global and the national, really very, very clear. It's very, very apparent as part of the landscape. So we can see, for example, again, quoting Sam, First Minister, talking about education. It's typically bombastic. Scots invented the modern world, and the Scots are responsible for the Enlightenment, which is possibly used by some of our European nations, but there is a story there, but I won't get distracted by it. So we have the modern world, the Enlightenment, social mobility, and so on. We can do so again, Now, I've highlighted the rocks will melt with the sun because it's a quotation from Burns, the national poet. And it's this kind of gameplay where there's always something that resonates in these speeches, in these documents. There's always something that's mobilizing the embedded resources that are culturally shared, that signal a better nation. And at the same time, it's used to say there will not be tuition fees in Scotland. There will not be imposed on Scottish students without particular choice of words. And then this is part of our Scottish settlement. Again, he's having fun with the idea of settlement. Our social contract. Popular sovereignty, social democracy, social contract. And this is, if we're looking at the education field, this is one of the sort of standout points of departure from UK government policy, where there's no introduction of fees for higher education. And there's indeed a retention of grants for school students and college students throughout their schooling. So we have in the education field, I think, a couple of interesting sets of governing resources for the Scottish government. They are, as I was trying to say, by distributing information and ideas, by generating debate, for presenting themselves as a learning government. You might think, well, given that they didn't expect to be in government, they didn't have much choice. But they've actually turned this into a strength. So instead of pretending that they have experience of being in government, of course they said, right, let's all embark on this collective learning project, working in partnership. We don't know it all. And then also there's the use of education as a site for the development of this growing autonomy, growing independence, and an agenda of fairness and inclusion. And I don't have time to go into this, but you might want to raise it in discussion. There's also a constant referencing of Europe. It's part of the way of attempting to move Scotland away from the South, but in terms of education policy, it's a constant thread in the narrative that they learn from Europe and they work with Europe, and they successfully have lobbied. Scotland has its own representation in Brussels in terms of Scotland House. It's lobbied the OECD to be represented in the PISA discussions. It's trying to create this sense that it has a separate existence and a separate set of relations, which losing my body. And the agenda they've had for education has been enormously ambitious. There's no stone unturned. It's cradle to grave stuff. And very early in their period of government in 2007, they took a big risk in transferring resources from higher education to early years, particularly to poor and disadvantaged areas. They had popular support for this, but the institutions didn't like it at all, so there was quite a lot of difficulty there. So they have the strategic areas of the early intervention, the curriculum, and the skills strategy. And all of these are strategies that attempt to generate practical activity, engagement, involvement, negotiation, mediation, at the level where the activity takes place. So they have really struggled, and this is an ongoing difficulty, to get the curriculum to be mediated and negotiated at school. What Scottish teachers have become accustomed to is a very strong framing of the curriculum, and it's handing down from the centre to the schools. So in a sense they're trying to change the culture. and to place on the teachers the responsibility for working with their local communities to devise a curriculum independently. You can see how this fits with the overarching narrative. Is troublesome, and we can come back to that in discussion, if you like. The same is true of this series project. But I'm going to conclude by very quickly looking at higher education. Sorry, I just briefly let you see that to give an idea of the range of stuff that we've been doing in the educational policy field. So, I mentioned the shift of resources. More choices, more chances is for young and unqualified school leavers, what in England are called NEETs, not employment education.
Training.
Thank you. I lost it. They select their international comparative as a concept. Very interesting, but important is quite interesting to me. It's integrated. Education Scotland is a new agency which combines the Development Agency and the Inspectorate. And this is one of the areas where I'm doing some work at the moment with my colleagues. Making an inspectorate responsible for curriculum development is a really, really unusual thing to do. And it's required the inspectorate to change its behaviour. Again, I'll have to be really quick, so I can't talk about this much, but if you want to come back to it, ask me. Otherwise, there's material on my website about this particular piece of research. It's ongoing. Essentially, it's asking inspectors no longer to go in and judge, but to go in and co-teach. And it's about leaving the school with the capacity to do it itself. So it's, again, this autonomy, independence. And it's hard to convey to you, if you haven't actually been in the Scottish education system and encountered a Scottish inspector in the past, to imagine what this is like. As one of the senior inspectors said to us, quite a few people have left because he said they couldn't part from their Her Majesty's Inspector briefcase and the hush that would fall over a school when they turned up at the door. So, according to our informants, these people okay, moving swiftly on to government universities. They've had to take on the university. I guess you can see that in terms of this narrative, it's England and Irish referencing, it's modernised nationalism, it's selected comparative, it's references backwards. The universities were always going to be a bit of a problem in a globalised, competitive world. Where they've hit difficulty is in persuading the elite institutions in Scotland to think of themselves as nationally identified. It's very difficult, as I'm sure you can see, for a university to simultaneously identify itself as a national project and be in the international Super League. So there is a real tension about what higher education will do, and of course they're also really worried about the fact that because they'll have fees, their resources may be diminishing, etc., etc. But what the SNP have managed to do is to get universities to agree to single outcome agreements and to draw the sector into a debate about how they should be governed. And in doing this, and this is why I'm showing it to you, they very skillfully used references back to the civic role of Scottish universities. Most of them are civic institutions. And to the nature of the democratic intellect, which is another of these myths that Scottish people like to believe about universities, and which, of course, like all myths, has some purchase in the real world. And the myth is about the possibility of anyone being able to go into university regardless of social origin. about that being historically embedded. Adam Smith leaving his field, going off to university age 13, etc., etc. That kind of backstory. So we can see that here. They are being forced to think about themselves as a collective, and in terms of the development of policy, they have had to agree that they will sink their differences, think about themselves within the space of Scotland, and look at policy developments, for example, the investment of funds in medical research from the perspective of the nation's need, not the individual university. At least that's the theory. It's a sticky one. And I've just given you an example of the things, the way that the government talks to the universities in bringing them to the table to work with this agenda. So it's language that's perhaps surprising to you. They're recognised as a key sector of the Scottish economy, which is familiar in terms of universities these days. So they get something for something, but they have to agree to the overall direction, the overall project. And they'll do this because they have a civic and national responsibility, and they guard the soul of Scotland. It's hard to imagine anyone saying that about my own university. So I'm ending now with an argument about the importance of narrative in understanding modernised nationalism, in seeing that this is a construction, that it's a construction that operates both with reference backwards and inwards to sets of shared assumptions, but they're selective shared assumptions, but also references outwards in an attempt to move consciousness about the nation into a different space, a different political, social space. The last thought I have is that this business of breaking the gaze away from the other in the South is perhaps a little bit threatened by the referendum, ironically, and perhaps more accurately by the activities of the UK coalition government and the No campaign in Scotland against independence, pro-unionist campaign, because it's been incredibly negative. And as a consequence, there is, at least in the media, a degree of distraction from this carefully crafted narrative, and a bit of a pulling back towards the, yeah, we need to be independent because we have to get away from them. And I think this may complicate the modernised nationalism agenda, but we'll see. Okay, so I'm done. Thank you for listening.